Will you drink to the earth and to the days which have passed upon it? Will you drink to the fullness which was and to friends who have passed on? Will you drink to good company well met?
Months ago, on the first day of a major Islamic religious holiday, a man casually walked up to a mosque in Stockholm, Sweden, and with hundreds of people looking on, he produced a Quran and began ripping out the pages. He wiped a few of those pages on his shoe, and then the man set the Quran on fire. 5,000 miles away at the U.S. State Department, Joe Biden's diplomats sprang into action. Within hours, the State Department issued the strongest possible condemnation of the Quran burning. Quote, "I will say that we do condemn it," said a State Department spokesman. Spokesman added that the demonstration had created, quote, "an environment of fear that will, quote, impact the ability of Muslims and members of other religious minority groups from freely exercising their right to freedom of religion or belief in Sweden." Now, whatever you think of that response, you have to admit it's a little bit surprising, because it was just 2 years ago that criminals torched, vandalized, and looted more than 80 churches across Canada. Unlike Sweden, Canada sits directly on the border of the United States. Some churches that went up in flames are a 10-minute drive from major population centers in this country. And yet, as the churches were razed, Joe Biden's State Department didn't say a word. One Quran burning in Sweden gets their attention. The destruction of dozens of entire churches a few miles north of the U.S. border, well, they couldn't be bothered by that. Neither could Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, as his country witnessed this historic campaign of anti-Christian terrorism 2 years ago, a campaign that somehow led to just one arrest. Trudeau said the violence was unacceptable, but also understandable. Watch.
As I've also said, it is unacceptable and wrong that acts of vandalism and arson are being seen across the country, including against Catholic churches. One of my reflections is I understand the anger that's out there against the federal government, against institutions like the Catholic Church. It is real, and it is fully understandable given the shameful history that we're all becoming more and more aware of and engaging ourselves to do better as Canadians. But I can't help but think that burning down churches is actually depriving people who are in need of grieving and healing and mourning from places where they can actually grieve and reflect and look for support. We shouldn't be lashing out at buildings that can provide solace to some of our fellow citizens.
It's understandable, Justin Trudeau says, as thugs torch Christian churches in his country. He ignores the attack on Christianity in his country, just as politicians in the United States ignored the deadly mass shooting by a trans terrorist at a Christian school in Nashville earlier this year, and just as they ignored the campaign of terrorism directed against pro-life pregnancy centers. In all these cases, elected officials didn't simply excuse violence against Christians. Instead, for years, with the help of corporate media, these officials engineered hoaxes for the purpose of demonizing Christians and encouraging more of this kind of violence. The point of these hoaxes was to create a pretext for the violence that inevitably followed in every single case. In the U.S., the hoax took the form of disingenuous warnings about trans genocide and an entirely fictional epidemic of anti-trans murders, murders that turn out in nearly every case to be related to domestic disputes, drugs, prostitution, and have nothing to do with the fact that the victim identifies as trans. In Canada, the hoax that prompted the church burnings began in earnest in May of 2021, when Canadian media reported that ground-penetrating radar had found the unmarked graves of more than 200 children near an Indian residential school in Kamloops, which is located in British Columbia. And many of the media reports and social media posts actually referred to these alleged sites as mass graves. The Canadian government had established these residential schools in the 19th century to assimilate native Canadian children into Canadian culture. They were mainly operated and funded by the Roman Catholic, Presbyterian, Methodist, and Anglican churches. Now, leftists in Canada have long maintained that these schools mistreated children. That's been conventional wisdom for some time in Canada. It's one of the reasons Canadian activists now argue that Canada should strip Catholic schools of all federal funding. And these supposed mass graves were the confirmation that they needed, the evidence to support the narrative that they already believed. Now, to be clear, it's long been suspected that children did die of diseases like tuberculosis and influenza at these schools. It's also true that in that time period, countless children of all races, ethnicities across the entire world died of these diseases. But the discovery of supposed mass graves at one of these schools to the media and the Canadian government meant something very different. The finding, they suggested, meant that Christians had systematically murdered children at these schools and then covered up the evidence. The Toronto Star reported the remains of 215 children have been found. The AP reported over 600 bodies found at another Catholic school for Indigenous children in Canada. U.S. News and many other outlets called it confirmation of, quote, genocide, etc. Within days, the reports that ground-penetrating radar had found unmarked graves at residential school sites all over Canada. This was a widespread epidemic, they told us. Here's a Bloomberg report on an additional discovery. Watch.
We started our radar penetrating research on June the 2nd of 2021. As of yesterday, we have hit 751 unmarked graves. This is not a mass grave site. These are unmarked graves. This is now today on Cowes' First Nation, and this is what we call today our community grave site. It became our community grave site after the 1970s, when the residential school was stopped overseen by the Roman Catholic Church and the Archdiocese. You're going to notice that they are in proper order. These that lay here are 1 meter by 1 meter apart in some cases.
So there were dozens of reports like this all throughout the summer of 2021. This was the reporting from the entire news media in the U.S. and Canada. And in response, Justin Trudeau knelt at one of the supposed grave sites and pretended to cry. Canada's celebrations were canceled. The government pledged hundreds of millions of dollars to investigate this. There were mass protests. Statues were toppled. One outlet says that says it serves Indigenous communities, APTN News, reported that, quote, demonstrators toppled statues of Queen Victoria and Queen Elizabeth in Winnipeg during rallies honoring the children discovered in unmarked graves on the sites of former residential schools over the past month. And here's what that looked like. Watch.
Take her down! Take her down! No pride genocide! No pride genocide!
Now, in the eyes of these rioters, Queen Elizabeth represents colonialism, and colonialism means taking advantage of the natives, not helping them. This anti-colonialist narrative is absurdly simplistic. It ignores the actual facts of history, so naturally they want to destroy all remnants of that history, starting with the statues. This was the mainstream position on the Canadian left. Harshal Walia, the executive director of the British Columbia Civil Liberties Association, which is basically Canada's version of the ACLU, encouraged the vandals. She declared, quote, burn it all down. 2 years later, the lies that these barbarians have been telling have completely fallen apart. No mass graves have been found at these supposed unmarked grave sites that have allegedly been uncovered with ground-penetrating radar. No bodies, no remains have been unearthed, none at all. It was all a hoax. The alleged gravesite in Kamloops, it turns out, that we told you about at the beginning, that was the site of a septic field, which was used to dispose of the school's sewage. The school dug a massive line of trenches 3 feet deep for that purpose. But the researchers, quote unquote, who scanned the site with ground-penetrating radar somehow weren't aware of that. I mean, how could they miss that little detail? How could they fail to consider other potential reasons why a school might dig trenches? How was a mass grave the very first and only assumption? Remember, the radar never detected bodies. Okay, ground-penetrating radar can't do that. It detected anomalies. And anomaly just means something unexpected or strange, something out of place. Well, if there's something unexpected in the ground, something out of place, why would you assume that the thing must be a grave of dead children? Aren't there other possibilities you should consider first?